So, what I would like to do today is just share some of those fragments. And again, not implying that they're right or wrong, but perhaps one additional way of simply looking at stanza two. Um, Stanza two for me is a challenge. And that's because HPB tells us when she's speaking about the stanzas that stanza two is so close to stanza one, which we really can't say too much about, that she leaves it to the intuition of the student to make the best of it. And that's probably the problem, because there are no real hints, although there are several ways, again, we can approach it. Now, the other piece that we feel is important is that HPB tells us in the SD itself, as she's rolling out these stanzas, that you really can't understand them without the three fundamentals. And I'm sure everyone here has heard them from different points of view in different ways for many, many years. And yet, those three fundamental ideas that can simply be expressed as deity or that rootless cause about which there's nothing we can say, law as it expresses itself in periodicity, in cycles, most known philosophically to us perhaps is reincarnation as the second, and then the evolutionary unfolding of the monadic totality in time and space that we call evolution. For today's purpose, this is important because stanza two is really something that stands in between stanza one, which there's not much we can say about, and stanza three, which is the birth, so to speak, of the universe. And I believe sometime in September, we get to talk about stanza three if we don't botch stanza two. And so that becomes important in the framework of the three fundamentals for me, because stanza one then represents to some degree, analogy and correspondence, the state of that absolute deity. Stanza three represents the third fundamental in terms of the unfolding of that possibility in time and space. And so stanza two represents, in some respect, that process of law that connects stanza one with stanza three. And so my whole view today is how to conceptualize something that stands in the middle of a threefold process that's really one process. And so those three fundamentals, again, become the spine and the structure in many, many different ways of understanding and application that help for myself understand this transition of what stanza two is all about. The general outline then that we're going to take today is to just review some preliminaries that may be helpful in trying to put stanza two in perspective as it relates to one and three. And then looking at, in general, a view of those stanzas so that we see at one time what it is that we're being presented with, what it is that we're being asked to understand that very little can be spoken about in terms of what it really is, to such a degree that HPB talks about the terms in a positive way that we can understand that don't relate to it. And so again, here we get a little view of what stanza 2 represents in terms of positive prose, words, ideas, and then what that may hint at in terms of an underlying process that for the most part remains invisible. And then we'll just try to go through each stanza itself from those views and then wrap it all up and hopefully have some time for questions. So, the preliminary considerations that we have to look at are several. And again, for myself, they just help structure in a very flexible way my mind in terms of looking at these. And so HPB tells us, as it relates to the proem, that it is the abstract algebraic formula for the entire unfolding of evolutionary cosmic process. And yet, based on analogy and correspondence, that process has to be reflected with appropriate modifications in every aspect of existence. And so again, the abstract idea that might relate to the first fundamental, that process through which that algebraic formula unfolds itself, and then 3, the actual concrete understanding of what that is. And so the proem, again, most of you must be familiar with, again, in the SD, gives us a general view as it relates to Cosmogênesis Book 1 of that process. And HPB tells us that the first stanza really represents the condition of the monads absorbed in that state that we can say very little about. And that state, again, if we're thinking about the first fundamental, would be a state analogous to that full total absorption without any aspects of differentiation that we can consider, yet without having lost the heart of individuality, which makes each monad unique after that human stage in existence. The second stanza, she says again, pertains so much and appears to be so much like the first that it's very difficult to talk about it. And so our nearly impossible task today. The third, she says, represents the emergence of the monad from their state of absorption. The fourth, she summarizes by saying, represents the awakening of the germ in the heart of the monad. So there's a distinction there between the monad itself and that center of essence that begins to awaken and to differentiate. And so the differentiation of that, she speaks about as the creative manifestation of the gods. And for her, the term gods simply represent the intelligible forces, not beings as of yet, the intelligible forces that are responsible for the governance and the guidance of not only the inner threefold aspect of the universe, but the lower fourfold aspect of the universe with which most of us are familiar. The next stanza, she says, relates to the formation of the world substance. And again, that brings it down to that state of existence that we're familiar with, represented by the nebula. And then she speaks about how that generates planets, solar systems, whichever aspect of application you're about to utilize, and then how that planetary formation takes us down to the fourth round and up to the point of man's development. And then thereafter, we switch over to anthropogenesis in book 2. And the way she explains these stanzas throughout the Secret Doctrine then becomes, in a sense, a prototypical method of application that can be used on different planes in different ways to further the understanding of many of these abstruse and abstract ideas. Now, this quote, really 2 paragraphs, both from the Secret Doctrine Dialogue series that was presented some years ago, is important to me because it clarifies really what we have to hold in mind as we attempt to understand any aspect of the teachings. And I think of these 2 paragraphs as an integrated network, almost a web of interconnected nodes wherein information is constantly flashing up, down, in, out, left, right, simultaneously at all times in terms of understanding. And so let me read these words. The beauty and the wisdom of the stanzas are in this, that they may be interpreted on 7 different planes, the last reflecting in its grossly differentiated aspect and copying on the universal law of correspondences or analogy, all that it sees before in the beginning. Segue, we should keep in mind fundamental first, second, and third again, because this points directly to the first, which is undifferentiated and non-manifest, manifesting itself in partial totality in that third. Let me just do a fast backwards flow. So that's where the first slide was referring to. That was the second in terms of preliminary considerations. The third has to do with the abstract formula. And then the fourth had to do now with this quote. And so the second portion of that quote is, every plane is a reflection and a copy of another plane. As it took place in the definite, undifferentiated plane, so it took place on the second, on the third, on the fourth, and so on. The student who understands well the gradual development, so to speak, and the progressive order of things will understand perfectly to which it applies. If we talk about the higher divine world, we shall talk just in the same way, and it goes on about the lower. And the second is we have 7 planes of matter. On each of these planes, there are 7 again, and each has its Laya point. When we are on our plane, there is a Laya point, which is the 7th of our plane. But when you have gone beyond those 7 planes or 7 divine ideations, as they are called sometimes, there is nothing. Ways to approach the stanzas. And again, I know this is a lot of preliminary, but it helps in terms of not thinking about the stanzas in a static, one-dimensional way, but thinking about them in a truly flexible way in which you can begin to apply. So HPV tells us that we should always use analogy and correspondence, above, below, subjective, objective, within, without, and work at applying those. She speaks about several keys of interpretation, which have to do with the cosmological, the anthropological, the theogonical, the astronomical, the astrological, the geological, physics, and then even further down, biological processes, psychological, metaphysical, and mystical, mathematics, and spiritual. And so again, it reflects that image of that network of nodes wherein when we think about these stanzas, we're not thinking of them in a one-dimensional linear way, but we're thinking about them in a multi-dimensional way. And so We can look at them as a meditational endeavor. We can explore them from the symbolic perspective of what the terms mean. We can explore the invisible processes that are behind those. And then we can begin to see in each stanza how we start from the eternal darkness, metaphorically. We move through that phase of law or how things unfold. And then we come to the germinal formation and manifest element of whatever it is that we're looking at. Today, it just happens to be cosmos. Flexibility. And so the terms that we find in these stanzas, there are 6 stanzas, and yet there's a whole lot of positive information about what's not present. And so she speaks to us, and perhaps in questions and answers, we can get more into detail about this, but about the unknown darkness, about the Laya points, about elements of homogeneity on the different planes, about the ceaseless breath, how that breath becomes motion and what the nature of that motion is as it relates to pulsations and vortical manifestations. She speaks to us about different states of consciousness and conditions of substantial being, as to the truths that relate to them, about the difference between divine thought and divine wisdom, or the divine bosom, and at the same time, how they are separate and yet one. She speaks about the pulse of a certain quality of energy that's related to that breath that has its own internal time clock. And that time clock is a time clock of ebb and flow, off and on. If you think computers, you might think 0, 1. And out of those movements, every combination of manifestation can be accounted for. She speaks about the Devamatri, or the womb, or the mother's substance, and Swabhavat, which is that substance which gives existence to its own self. She speaks about the Lipika, the Tattvas, the eternal law, and the Ahi. She speaks about time in terms of hour and the ray as it reflects the logos, or the different stages of logoic manifestation and development. She speaks about the heart and what the nature of that germ falling from 3 into 4 into 6 into 7 is, and eventually unfolding as that 7-fold manifest universe into the lap of Maya. And she speaks of all of that in some regards as the web of light that is the universe in its manifest totality. So, where are we coming from and where are we going? The first slide, as it relates to introductions into stanza 2 itself, has to do with, I think it's sloka 8 of stanza 1. And it says, the one form of existence stretched boundless, infinite, causeless, in dreamless sleep. And life pulsated unconscious in universal space throughout that all presence, which is sensed by the open eye of the Dhamma. Why is this important? It's important from where I stand because this is what immediately precedes stanza 2. It's the state of consciousness, it's the condition of substance, it's the quiescence of energy working that moves from this seemingly empty state gradually and imperceptibly to stage 2, which is stanza 2. And yet, we've got to account for how in stanza 2, we end up at the beginning of stanza 3. And the beginning of stanza 3 reads, the last vibration of the 7th eternity thrills through infinitude. And that last vibration marks the endpoint of stanza 2. So we've got a beginning point for stanza 2, and we have an end point for stanza 2. And now we've got to figure out what's in between those 2 points. And so at the beginning of stanza 3, we know the mother swells, expanding from within, without, like the bud of the lotus. And so within that mundane egg, as HPB explains for the beginning of stage 3, is the germ. And so somehow we have to account for how that germ gets there, given that in stanza 1, there's nothing that we can conceptually speak about, either in state of consciousness or in regards to manifestation. And so really what we're talking about is the in-between transitional process on a cosmic level, on an individual level, on a biological level, on an astrological level, whichever way you want to use within any framework. We're talking about the transition between point A and point C, which is B, in between. And so it's that which occurs as the last pralaic vibration of stanza 1, and somehow the transitions and modifications of that vibration to the point where it is now able to propel a universe into manifestation, that point of the Big Bang, perhaps, if we want to use the current metaphors, from which matter begins to take form and manifest objects. So what we're going to do is a pre-reading of the stanzas in order to get a whole idea of, again, where we're coming from and where we're going. And so this is, Erica, the point at which I would like you to read these, please, if you would.
Yes. Where were the builders, the luminous sons of Manvantaric dawn, in the unknown darkness, in their Ahi Paranashpana, the producers of form from no form, the root of the words, the Devamatri and Swavabat rested in the bliss of non-being. Where was silence? Where the years to sunset? No, there was neither silence nor sound, not save ceaseless eternal breath, which knows itself not. The hour had not yet struck, the ray had not yet flashed into the germ, the Matri Padma had not yet swollen. Her heart had not yet opened for the one ray to enter, thence to fall as 3 into 4, into the lap of Maya. The 7 sons were not yet born from the web of light. Darkness alone was father, mother, Swavabat, and Swavabat was in darkness. These two are the germ, and the germ is one. The universe was still concealed in the divine thought and the divine bosom.
Thank you. That summation, really, if we're paying attention, explains all of the remaining stanzas. In those 6 slokas, somehow we've come from no seed to seed. We've come from the state of unknown darkness, pralaya, and there has been a process going on that has been able to manifest pre-cosmically all of the elements that are necessary to create the germ, the DNA of the universe that's going to become manifested as, again, if we use the metaphor of the Big Bang, it is exponentially exploding outwards and growing. So this hones in again to the process of stanza 2, perhaps, which has to do with how do we generate from nothing the things that are necessary, the lives that are necessary to generate the manifestation of a universe. So, where were the builders? The luminous sons of Manvantaric dawn. And HPB explains to us that the builders are all of the forces, invisible and visible, that are necessarily present to manifest that universe. The term luminous refers to the consciousness, the intelligible nature and force of those builders, and they have been termed the Ahi. And those that are non-luminous, because she says in the commentaries that the Ahi themselves are those luminous forces, intelligible in nature, yet having no self-will, no self-consciousness, that give rise to that dual stream, so to speak, of luminosity as it relates to intelligible awareness, and non-luminosity as it relates to the awareness that is so dim that it appears to have no elements of possible consciousness within it. The unknown darkness, again, we can talk about from the perspective of the absoluteness, which she makes a distinction between absoluteness and the absolute. And then she makes a further distinction between the absolute and Parabrahm and Mulaprakriti. So again, here we have a threefold dance: the absoluteness that we can know nothing about, the concept of the second one, which is absolute and infinite in and of itself, that we might have some intuitions of, and then those elements that are responsible for the immediate manifestation of the universe. And so again, we're looking at this transitional phase that stanza 2 represents, but now applied to one of the higher aspects of cosmos that we typically don't even talk about. And yet, if we believe the teachings, one day that will be spoken about. Right now, we're still dealing scientifically with the things that have come after the Big Bang, although there are individuals that are contemplating in that scientific world what came before the Big Bang. And she tells us that these Ahi, in their various degrees, because they take up the first plane, the second plane, and the third plane of cosmos, or the universe to be. Not only were they still in the Parinishpana state, but yet as they were revving up and becoming ready to leave that state, carried on that vibrational modification of the great breath as it too moves from one stage to another. She tells us that the great breath pertains to that which is truly spiritual, and then that moves into variability of motionality, which has to do with pulsation, vertical movements, and other dynamics that eventually turn into motion at the point wherein manifestation is beginning to occur, i.e., at the point where the Ahi, that are the containers and the reflectors of divine thought, begin to awaken, such that now the production of the tiny little lives that are pre-cosmic are beginning to manifest. And yet that degree of manifestation is not even spoken about, because we have a hard enough time talking about manifestation as it pertains to the beginning moments of what we call the Big Bang, before matter as we understand it was created. And so she's pointing us to a process that's going on even before there. Those Ahi are the producers of form from no form. They themselves have no form, and yet they produce form. So the positive interpretation or the positive understanding is that the builders were not awake, yet they're builders. And if they're builders, they have to be different from that state of the absolute. And that last thrill again of stanza 1 has been busy. That breath, that inner, and I have no words for it, but what the equivalent of an inner motion would be, that is not the great breath in its absoluteness, is changing and modifying. And one, as an aside, one mystic that describes these processes extremely well, and that HPB has pointed us to, is Jakob Burma or Jacob Boehme. He is a process mystic par excellence. And he talks about these same processes that HPB speaks about in a different way, but a way that is accessible to Western contemplation and consideration. And then she tells us, once the ahi, the form from no form, is acknowledged, that the root of the world, the Devamatri, which is both the substance and the womb, both things are no different from each other. And Svabhava, different names for a similar condition of substance having properties that, again, we typically do not talk about because they don't really fit in to the time-space conceptuality that we have now. But she says these states, conditions, and wombs have their own, again, inherent breath and pulse with the on-off switch. They act according to the greater law that is pre-cosmic as opposed to post-cosmic genesis. And that law, as it pertains to breath and vibration and the nature and properties of vibration, which again are not spoken about, is inherent within this substance. But none of this was yet, although it was being prepared. All of this rested in the bliss of non-being. Let's see. Second, where was silence, where the ear is to sense it? There was neither silence nor sound, nothing again except for that ceaseless eternal breath. But we shouldn't think of the ceaseless eternal breath again as doing nothing. It was very, very busy. And it was busy in its nature and its modifications, getting everything ready for that third stage. So it was constantly active, constantly manifesting things, constantly generating lives. But again, nothing that we typically talk about, only what the teachings point to. And she tells us that the ceaseless eternal breath pertains more to the absolute, but not the absoluteness. That word eternal puts a limit on things in a grand way, which again is analogous to the first one and its limitations as being a reflection of that absoluteness. She then goes on to tell us that consciousness was not present at that time. And this is a tickler for some, because we always have that tendency to say absolute consciousness. Everything is conscious. And yet she says consciousness and perception require limitation. They require differentiation. And so in this in-between state, there was no differentiation that we are typically used to accounting for, even from the metaphysical side, because the elements that generate that type of life was not accessible post, but only during that intermediate stage of becoming. So again, we're moving from non-being to becoming, to that third stanza of actual birth of substance and consciousness as we know it. Hence, the breath knows itself not because of the fact that the ahi, as she says, were not present. She says, the other thing about where was silence, where the ears to hear it, that we have to embrace is that even though things are not manifest, that does not mean that they don't exist. And so as she puts it, nothing goes into absolute existence or falls out of absolute existence. All things are. And the hint at understanding that process has to do with an understanding of what the substratum nature of all being and life is. That all things in conjunction with law can be and not be is the essence of stanza 2. So when we typically think about archetypes and outlines and things like that in Cosmos, as she explains for those that are familiar with page 200 of the SD, the archetypal, the creative, the formative, and the manifest, there is on a deeper level, a different kind of archetypal appreciation of law that's based on a deeper image of nature that cannot be expressed in terms of form and yet is. And she says, again, it's important to consider that idea rather than argue about it with words that a thing is or a thing is not. That was what we were just referring to in her statement. The idea that things can cease to be and yet remain is a fundamental one in Eastern psychology. And that becomes a fundamental truth that we have to take into consideration, even as we entertain these 3 stanzas with a particular emphasis on stanza 2. Because even in stanza 1, depending upon how we apply and understand the word pralaya, it still has the potentiality for all things. The hour had not yet struck, the ray had not yet flashed into the germ, the Matripadma had not yet swollen. So again, we're talking about the fact that the logos itself had not yet been activated by that ceaseless breath in its modifying conditions of the ultimate substance, so to speak, to turn it on in such a way that it would flash into the germ that it in essence created. And so for those of you that are familiar with that first unmanifest logos, we know that the teachings say it flashes and it withdraws. And then it thrills throughout the infinitude of the substance that is there. And then it is the substance which goes through several more transformations to become the triangle, which becomes the germ in the mundane egg, i.e., again, we're looking at the beginnings of stanza 3. And obviously, if we haven't created the germ, the Matripadma, at that 3rd stage of removal from the ground state, has not swollen. It could not swell because the germ and the life that animates that germ were not. Another thing she tells us is that even though we're talking about different things regarding words, they're not different. And that's something else that we have to ponder very deeply, how the words we use cut up wholes that exist as integral activities, all going on simultaneously within themselves. And yet when we talk about them, we have to talk about that process and this process and that process, as opposed to being able to capture the entire process with our expression, although the entire process can be captured a different way. The heart had not yet opened for the one ray to enter. So now here we're looking at the inside moving towards that germ versus the heart opening up in terms of manifestation. Again, that's all stanza 3. We're still in stanza 2. And so you might say that there's an inner heart that has to open to become receptive to that ray as it relates to the nature of the substance. But then, as we'll see in the last sloka, that ray that is a reflection, or as she puts it, a phohatic impress of the divine thought, is the same as the divine bosom. And so she's bringing us back always to the unity or the oneness of the condition of the more real state versus how we typically think of things as separate in time and space. And so, as she says, the heart had not yet opened for the one ray to enter, and as a result, we could not establish those three, and those three could not fall into four. And we know that when we're looking at the triangle that she uses over and over again, first point at the top, second side mother, third side son, the connecting, and then the reflection of that, with that top point now being the low point, as the beginning point of manifest existence, again, in that third stanza. The three, as she says, that triangle, are the germ in the mundane egg. And that germ has to be activated by the ray, which is inherent within itself, in order to begin the differentiation, stage 3, in terms of the universe that we're somewhat familiar with in terms of how we live. The 7 sons were not yet born from the web of light. Darkness alone was father, mother, Swabhava, and Swabhava was in darkness. And so the 7 sons, she again is pointing to stanza 3, although the 7 sons from the inner side relate to the Ahi. And then the 7 sons on the inner side, before the Ahi, relate to the aspects of breath and motion. And I'm putting that word motion in quotes because it's not that post-genetic cosmic motion, but that pre representation of motion that we conceptualize just for explanatory purposes that eventually give rise to those ahi that are considered to be the primal forces responsible subjectively for the manifestation of the objective universe. Darkness alone was father, mother. And again, this points to the fact that every duality has its preceding androgynous state. We typically talk about 1, 2, and 3. But HPB gives us a different progression in the SD. She talks about unity. She talks about the androgynous state. The androgynous state is that image of Krishna that everybody has looked at in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, not so much from a clear-cut positive and negative distinction, but from the fact that all of that is one. From the androgynous state, within that, there is a polarity that occurs. And HPB used the analogies with cellular division to explain some of this. And then from that polarity, there is a separation and a definitive duality. And the nature of that duality, based upon the nature of the motion and the breath, for some reason creates what we call opposites, polar opposites, that are now distinctly appearing aspects that can interact in a different way to create even further differentiations of that polarized energy that arose from a singularity. And so in that progression, she's giving us the flow of all of the pre-cosmic activity that arises from the one degree of substance that is activated by the last thrill of stanza 1. Those 7 suns again become the lower Sephiroth that she speaks about, that are the cosmocrators for the manifest universe, but that's occurring in time and space. These are still pre-time and space. The last sloka that she gives us is the first sloka in my mind. These 2 are the germ, and the germ is 1. The universe was still concealed in the divine thought and the divine bosom. So as the last sloka, she brings us back to the very beginning of the first stanza 2, pre-sloka. And that's when that last thrill of stanza 1 occurs. And that divine thought and the divine bosom are 1. And HPB tells us that no matter how we describe that state, whether we say substance, whether we say absolute matter, whether we call it, I don't even know what other words we might use, it is a state that has inherent within it its own ability to activate or deactivate. Just like in our brains, we have a time determining nucleus that coordinates all of the body rhythms and oscillations. So there is such a thing within the very substance of the universe that has in its breath the ability to modify things in such a way that divine thought manifests as opposed to the substance that it requires to manifest itself. So divine thought and the divine bosom are 1 in their beginning, but also are 1 in their manifestation, because in time and space, we find no degree of thought without some degree of substance that accompanies it. And so we're looking at that inner process, perhaps, that exists in stanza 2, that we say is very much like stanza 1, but has a signature distinctly different from stanza 1. It is, if we use analogy and correspondence, very similar to that state. And I'm thinking about autogamy. There are certain plants that have the ability to self-fertilize. And it is a state that is in existence wherein the processes of self-fertilization are gone on, but we only see and suspect that after we begin to see the product of that process of fertilization. And so what we would be looking at, perhaps if we used analogy and correspondence, is the process of the buildup of DNA. How the very substances manifest the very atoms, how those atoms take on characteristics to become elements, how those elements work together to create within that DNA the bases, those 4 bases that are necessary to create the amino acids that are necessary to, in various combinations, create the proteins, and the proteins that then come together to create all of these subsequent forms and types of life that we come to understand that grow out of that DNA. And so the process, again, of stanza 2 is an independent or inner process that is not obvious to the birth. Again, we typically don't know in a routine way what's going on inside the mother's belly as that fetus is first appearing and then growing. We see the baby that we love and we call child or grandchild or cousin or friend or whatever. That's the product. The birth of the universe from stanza 3 is the product. That inner process that's going on that requires a different type of understanding is the becoming of all things to the point of that process. And the stanza 1 again becomes the ground from where that process begins. And so if we now zoom out and we say, okay, I've got that, but where does the energy come from? Or how does the breath modify itself? And there's an easy answer as a metaphor, an analogy, and correspondence to use in our teachings. And there's a similar one that's used in a different way in modern science. So I'll give you them both. In theosophy, we always talk about the moon and the earth and how the earth is a product of the moon, or the reincarnating product of the principles that have now been sent from the moon into a Laya center. And that Laya center begins to develop, and out of that Laya center comes a universe or a galaxy cluster or a galaxy or a solar system or a globe or a being, depending upon what level of application we're working. And so if we think of this universe as we should, as a reincarnation of a previous universe, and that pralaic state as the in-between, now not in between pralaya and birth, but in between death, laic, and preparation for awakening, we can see that the universe itself has transferred its energy. And HPB tells us that the energy that activates that mula prakritic state of substance comes from beyond mula prakriti itself. And so if we think about the analogy and correspondence of the reincarnation process, it puts it into a perspective that is at least handleable, using the correspondences, the analogies, etc., so that we can get a little grip on a process that applies as much to the universe as it does to ourselves. And that whole application becomes very evident in anthropogenesis when we work this line of thinking. The second example is that of the big bounce in cosmogenesis. They talk about the Big Bang as just that beginning point from which the cosmos explodes and all of the gluons and protons and forces are established. But then they also have this one they call the Big Bounce. And that's the expansion of a universe, and then as it's dying, it's collapse. And then there's a little tunnel, and then it bounces out and expands again. So it's almost as though it goes through that Laya center. Now, they would never say that that was the reincarnation of a universe, but we could see the connections that exist there as possibilities. Not saying that they are, but just saying in terms of making abstract thoughts concrete possibilities. And yet the connecting tunnel between the collapse of one universe, the little tunnel, and the expansion of the other universe is stanza 2. It is the in-between state wherein all things that have gone into rest begin to awaken and yet remain outside the visual understanding, typically, of scientists or even ourselves. And yet in that in-between state is all of the activities that we have been talking about from the point of view of cosmos, from the point of view of the awakening of life, the fructification of the germ. And so as a summary, what I would like to do is just show you, it's a little, nothing but circles. But when HPB is trying to explain the first logos, the second logos, the third logos, that becomes the germ in the mundane egg, she said in the transactions and the SD, a lot of confusion, a lot of confusion, a lot of confusion. And so what does she give us? She says, point blank, the blackness in the background is the absoluteness, period. End of story. Nothing to say about that. The first circle is the potential logos, that first unmanifest, uncreated logos, a modification of the breath. The dark circle is the shooting forth of that logoic force. And remember that the divine bosom as substance is the same as the divine thought as intelligence and consciousness. And that's what thrills throughout all of that. And she refers that to the Deva Prakritic light. Or again, as she says, the Ahi, who are the luminous suns that produce both luminous and non-luminous beings. And those beings are the beings that fill in all of the various aspects and hierarchies in the development of life. That third circle then becomes the point giving rise to the expression she uses in the transactions are Keter, Hakma, and Bina, or the supreme, the wisdom, and the understanding. She also speaks about Brahma, Vak, and Viraj. She speaks about creation, preservation, and regeneration. And so all of these triads you will see at every level of existence and non-existence that's not empty. And those are the three fundamentals transforming themselves from plane to plane, from principle to principle, from substance to substance throughout the entire expression, both subjective and objective, of what we call the universe and ourselves. The 6 lines inside are then that germ that when it is ready to awaken, gives rise to those 6 plus the 7th point, the 7 creative demiurgic beings, or the 7 Sethrock, as she explains it, or the lower 7 Dhyani charms. And so in this stanza, and again, you can see from the top of that slide, the ring past not, arbitrary ring past not, because all of this comes before the Big Bang. And these are the things that we have to come to an understanding of: what the breath is, how that breath works, what the modifications are, divine thought in the divine bosom, the law, the Fohatic impression that arises from the divine thought, the first unmanifest logos, the second semi-manifesting logos, the third that becomes the point in the mundane egg, which is typically what we don't see. This is all pre-Big Bang. And then post-Big Bang, the point as in Keter, and how the entire objective universe then begins to unfold. And we can apply this to our own birth. We can apply this to the birth of planets, to the birth of universes. We can apply it to the multiverse. We just need, going back to some of the preliminaries, the absolute flexibility of mind regarding principles, planes, substance, degrees of consciousness, what consciousness is and what it is not, as it all relates to law and how that law becomes impressed and reflected in all of substance, and the fact that law is coeval, as she says, with that absolute. So on that point, I will say thank you.